The laptop. Good afternoon and welcome to the third installment of the Douglas R. Wilson Lecture featuring Stephen Gaetz. So I'd like to start by respectfully acknowledging that we are located on Treaty 6 territory, traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people. My name is Kim Rain and I'm Associate Dean Research in the School of Public Health, and I'll be your moderator for this evening. In these lectures, which are open to the wider community and welcome to all of you, we aim to provide information and invite you to think critically about pressing public health issues facing people locally or globally, or locally and globally. And homelessness is certainly one of those issues. Now you can read about Douglas R. Wilson, or Doug, in the program, but as he has joined us today, I would like to acknowledge him. Doug, do you want to just sort of stand up so everybody can see? Why rely on a picture when you have the real life? Doug is a friend, a colleague, an ambassador, and an ongoing supporter of the School of Public Health. Indeed, the School of Public Health would not exist without Doug's efforts over a decade ago. And most recently, he and his wife Jane, who's hiding in the middle, generously established the 10th Anniversary Graduate Award to support students in the school. So thanks to Doug for all of his work, and to Doug and Jane for their contributions. And I have to say, I'll just add a little personal acknowledgement here, in that I will always have a very soft spot in my heart for Doug, because 20 years ago he hired me. I have some housekeeping that I need to cover. First of all, as the signs outside indicated, there will be photographs and video recordings of this event. And the personal information that may be recorded is collected under the authority of Section 33C of the Alberta Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act, and will be protected under Part 2 of that Act. If gathered, it will be used for the purposes of educational and promotional materials produced by the school. I actually had to read that. If you are on social media, please participate in the conversation online using the hashtag DRW Lecture. I also want to make a pitch for the U Alberta United Way campaign. 120,000 people in our community are living in poverty, and this is certainly relevant to the topic of tonight's presentation. 40,000 of those are children and youth, and these numbers are not just statistics. They're our neighbors, our friends, maybe a family member or colleague, and many of our students here at the University of Alberta. Today we can all be a part of the solution to end poverty, and by working together we can create a different reality, one where each person held down by poverty is given a chance to take a different pathway, a pathway out of poverty. On behalf of the University of Alberta, I'd like you to consider how you might help. Between now and October 27th, please consider participating in the United Way campaign, and you can learn more about the campaign in the foyer after the event. So now to the main event. It's my privilege to introduce our speaker today, Stephen Gaetz. Dr. Gaetz is a professor in the Faculty of Education at York University and director of the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness and the Homeless Hub. He's also president of Raising the Roof, a leading Canadian charity that focuses on long-term solutions to homelessness. Dr. Gaetz is committed to a research agenda that foregrounds social justice and attempts to make research on homelessness relevant to policy and program development, very much community-engaged scholarship. He has played a leading international role in sharing knowledge about homelessness, and he's here to speak about the issue of homelessness and how so many people in our communities are affected, and he will challenge us to think a little differently about it and to look for solutions. So please welcome Dr. Gaetz.
Thank you. Thank you. Is this working? Can you hear me with this? Sounds echoey. So thank you. I'm really thrilled to be here. I like coming to Edmonton, and I know you're thinking, oh, great, someone coming from Toronto to tell us how to do things. And so I want to assure you that I was born and raised in Calgary. That doesn't help, does it? No. But I do love coming here. One of the reasons I love coming here is that I consider this city to be one of the leaders in innovation on homelessness in Canada. So it's always great to come here. You've got great leadership in the community, but you also have people doing really interesting work, great programs, that kind of thing. And there's an interest in doing things differently. And that's what I want to talk about today, because the older I get, and yes, indeed, I am getting older, the more I consider the way we respond to homelessness in Canada to not only be not effective, but to be wrong. We're not doing the right thing in the way we respond to homelessness. Now that's an indictment, but the flip side to that is I think we can do something better and bold and turn things around. We can end homelessness in Canada, but it's going to mean we have to evolve our response. And in particular, think about what is the role of preventing homelessness. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. But to do that, we need to rewind the tape here, because not everyone here may have a deep knowledge of homelessness in Canada, why it's a problem now, and how we're dealing with the problem. So let's start with a short history of mass homelessness in Canada. So until David Holchansky, who's a well-known researcher on housing and homelessness, has argued, and it's the case, that until the end of the 1980s, homelessness was a marginal problem in Canada, and it was typically single adult men who were homeless, and you had, small shelters in that. The problem exploded in the 1990s. We created mass homelessness. We created it, and that's an important thing, because to solve a problem, you have to know what causes it. And the outcome is that we now estimate that on any given night, there are 35,000 people who are homeless, and that's mostly just talking about people who touch the system, not the hidden homeless. And over a course of a year, it's over 235,000. Over the years, the population has become more diverse, and so we've had to pay attention to things like youth homelessness, family homelessness, the fact that Indigenous people are massively overrepresented amongst the homeless population. So we've created this problem. So how do we deal with it? I always say that there are three things you can do. Or wait a minute, I'm jumping ahead here. How did we create the problem? The first thing is that we've seen a big transformation in Canada over the years, and it plays out differently in different provinces. You're a resource-based economy, so you have ups and downs. When things are up, there's well-paying jobs, and when things are down, they're not, and you're in the down cycle now. But what we've seen over that period of time is that in terms of the changing structure of our economy, the top 20% of Canadians have benefited the most from these shifts. The middle 40% has been kind of stagnant. The bottom 20% have seen declining income, particularly like the bottom 5%. So you mentioned, 120,000 people living in poverty in Canada. 18% of all low-income Canadians spend more than 50% of their income on housing. That's a problem. So that's one thing. We've also seen, and it comes and goes in different jurisdictions, cutbacks to benefits and reduced access to supports. But a big thing that happened in Canada in the 1990s was a gamble that was taken. Up until the late 1980s, the government of Canada was investing in building up to 20,000 units of affordable housing annually through direct spending. In 1990, that dropped down to almost nothing. And the idea was to shift from direct spending in affordable housing and instead use tax expenditures to subsidize the building of homes, private homes and home ownership. I took advantage of that. I used my RSPs in a registered home ownership plan. There is incentives to the private sector. The idea was that the government should get out of the way and we should let the private sector fill in the gap. And it will build rental housing, it'll build low-income housing, and it'll build housing for middle-class people, it'll build housing for all. Now, the sad truth is that the results of that experiment are in. That was a disastrous policy move. We've seen the population of Canada increase by 30% since 1990, and very little investment in affordable housing since then. Alberta's been actually not as bad as other places. But the outcome has been the rising cost of housing intersects with declining incomes, putting many more people at risk. So how do we deal with this issue? I always say there are three things you can do to address homelessness. Number one is you can prevent it from happening in the first place, right? So stop people from becoming homeless. Identify who's at risk, figure out what systems are driving homelessness, do something about it. The second thing is you're going to need a crisis response, because no matter how good you are at prevention, some people are still going to fall into homelessness. And the third thing you're going to need to do is help people exit homelessness. And the challenge in Canada is that our investment, and this is true elsewhere in Canada more so than Alberta, the bulk of our investment has been in that middle part. Emergency services and supports, which includes not only nice things like shelters and day programs, but it also means using law enforcement as a way to deal with the problem, right? Because people don't like seeing homeless people around. That's been the dominant response, and it's a failed response. So imagine this, right? So you had the big fire in Fort Mac, and a couple of years ago in Slave Lake, right? So when you have a big fire like that, you evacuate the city. People have to leave their homes. They're temporarily homeless. So what do people do? They wind up staying with relatives and friends, so they're couch surfing. Other people rent property or hotel rooms. And then for those who have nowhere to go, we commandeer gymnasiums and hockey rinks, because this is Canada. And we put people on cots side by side and give them bag lunches. Now, if you went to Fort Mac 10 years from now and there are still people in that gymnasium, you would say, we messed that up. And that's basically what we've done in Canada. We've mistaken the emergency response for a solution. Now, what we need to do is get to a place like this where we shift the investment and the activity to prevention and exiting homelessness. And this is where the second phase of response to homelessness comes in. It involves three things: plans to end homelessness, adopting housing first as a critical intervention, and focusing on those who are chronically homeless, who have high acuity mental health and addictions. Often they're not even in homeless shelters, that kind of thing. And in Canada, this came to the US in about the year 2000. In Canada, started to be adopted. Alberta was the leader on it. And the government of Canada went down this road about 4 years ago. Now, it's produced some very interesting results, and I have to say that Edmonton, amongst big cities in Canada, is, I would call, the leader in this area, right? You've had a drop of about 30%, is that right, in homelessness over the last 6 years, right? No other major cities come close. Not close. Toronto hasn't had any drop. So this is important, right? Housing first, as an evidence-based approach, works. We have some work to do on it to find out how to make it more effective for subpopulations like women and youth, and take an indigenous-led approach. But the evidence base is pretty strong. The At-Home Shuswap Project's largest research project on housing first done in the world, a clinical trial that demonstrated the effectiveness of the intervention. So, is this enough to end homelessness? Right? Now, bear in mind in the US, that investment, the promise is if we put all our eggs in the housing first basket and house all the chronically homeless people, then we can take care of everybody else and wait to work on prevention. And I'm not critiquing housing first, because I think we should have a housing first led solution, both as a philosophy of community intervention, but also as a practice. But the results, right, coming from the US, if you combine housing first with plans to end homeless, target the chronically homeless, it equals ending homeless. The results are compelling, but not in a positive way. How many of you have been to a major American city? You probably went to San Francisco and didn't see a single homeless person. Or Chicago, there's no homeless people there because they solved it. Well, this is a stat from 2014, so it's a bit dated, but it shows over an 8-year period the decline in homelessness is about 10% with all that investment. That's a good thing, but it's in that window where we can't really determine if that was the result of the strategy and the investment or not, right? Other factors can be at play in affecting the amount of homelessness we have. So what it does suggest is that it's not enough. We have to turn off the pipeline in. If you have a burst pipe in your basement, you start with buckets and that doesn't seem to work so well. Then you go to the hardware store and get a really good gas pump, and it's like pumping the water out, pumping the water out. And that might seem like you're doing good work, but at a certain point, you've got to fix that pipe. And that's a conversation we have not had in Canada. And it hasn't been had in the US. So that's what we're going to talk about here, right? We really need to rethink the approach to homelessness, right? And include prevention. This isn't to replace housing first. We're going to need housing first there, but we need to focus on prevention. We can't just keep relying on the crisis response or wait till people are homeless. And so to do that, we need to address what do we mean by homelessness prevention, because we don't have a language for it in Canada. And people will say, well, we could do homelessness prevention, but nobody knows what that is. So let's talk about what that is. We released this report earlier this year that was a framework for homelessness prevention that was basically set out to define what it is and frame what it looks like and give communities some guidance on how to approach it. And to address, what time am I speaking to, by the way? 5:40, okay, so I translate that into Steve time, that's like 5:45. 5:40, okay. I'll just talk faster. Give me some coffee. I'm good. So to prevent something, you have to understand the causes. So if we look at, this is how I think about the drivers of homelessness, right? So there are individual and relational factors, right? So, you know, people, it's either like family relationships are problematic, people might lose their job, individual things can happen, there might be mental health or mental illness in the household, people can break up in a relationship. There's lots of things that can happen, and that's usually where we think about the causes of homelessness, individual things. Because if you ask somebody who's homeless, what happened, why are they homeless, that's where they'll go. Like, nobody's going to come up and say, you know what, my problem started when Canada canceled the National Housing Strategy in 1990. But that's probably a more important factor in many ways, right? So we need to look at structural factors, right? Do we have enough affordable housing in this country? Are there adequate incomes for people who are struggling? Do we have the mental health and addiction supports? How are we doing on racism? Right? We don't like to address that question, but if you have trouble getting a good education, getting an apartment, getting a job because of the color of your skin or because you're indigenous, that's going to increase your risk that you can be homeless. What about LGBTQ2S youth? They make up 30% of the youth homelessness problem. So homophobia and transphobia make it difficult for many young people to stay in their house or in their community. These are structural drivers. This isn't about the young person being bad or weak or lacking motivation. This is somebody else's problem imposed on them. So we need to think about that. And then the final thing are systems failures. We have institutions in society that are not designed to transition people very well. So I'll give you several examples. One is prison. As part of our Get Tough on Crime approaches in Canada, we regularly discharge people from prison into homelessness. In spite of the fact that the research evidence shows if you do that, the recidivism rate goes through the roof. Why? Because people have no money. So that Get Tough on Crime, you know, if we really believe in crime prevention and safety, we have to avoid that kind of policy. We have to turn off that tap. People get discharged from health care, inpatient, whether it's, you know, health or mental health, into homelessness, into emergency shelters, which aren't equipped to take care of people. And what we know from research in that area is that whatever condition they were in the hospital for tends to worsen. And then finally, child protection. This is a big one. We're going to come back to this at the end. Our child protection system is built around what worked in the 1950s, where you could leave home, quit school at 16 or 17, leave home, get a job in a factory, rent a house, get married. Those days are long gone, right? In Canada today, the percentage of people between 20 and 29 who live with their parents is over 42%. And it's not because people are like, oh goody, I love being at home and having mom and dad ask me who I went out with last night. It's because they can't move out. Cost of housing's up here, the good paying jobs are gone. So why is it then we have a system where we take young people into care, we say as a state we're going to be responsible for young people, and then when they turn 18 it's like happy birthday, here are your clothes and a shopping bag. right? Like, now that's simplified, it's simplistic in a way, but it tells us something important. That there are institutions outside of the world of homelessness that are implicated in producing and sustaining homelessness. This is important if we want to think about prevention. So, how do we think about homelessness prevention? You know, a good place to start is the public health model, primary, secondary, and tertiary. So, I don't know if you can see that well on the screen, but anyway, you can? Then that means I have to explain it. Okay. So primary prevention means working upstream, right, to usually at a population-based level to reduce the factors that will increase the risk that somebody will become homeless. And this is important, right? It also means targeting subpopulations where the risk may be higher. So in a similar way with public health measures. Secondary prevention refers to when people are at imminent risk or have become homeless, how can we intervene early to reduce the negative outcomes of that experience? And then tertiary prevention is if somebody has a condition, what can we do to ensure that it does not recur? So how do we address it so that it isn't a recurring problem? And so this is a way of thinking about homelessness. And so here's our definition of the prevention of homelessness. And you will note that we're focusing specifically on stopping people from entering homelessness, and on the other hand, helping people exit and giving them the supports they need to reduce the chance that they ever become homeless again. And this is important, because what we don't want in the community is for people to think that things that we do while people are homeless are preventive, right? A cooking program or an employment program, work around self-esteem, training, those are important, but they aren't preventing homelessness. It always has to be housing-led, whether you're talking about stopping people flow in or helping them exit. So, the other thing to think about when we talk about preventing homelessness is whose responsibility is it? We've made the sector responsible for solving a problem that is not of its making. We need all the orders of a government involved, and we need to work across ministries and jurisdictions. I always call homelessness a fusion policy issue. So at a provincial level, right, usually the homelessness strategy is either directed by whoever's responsible for housing, or in terms of youth homelessness, it might involve who's ever responsible for child and family services. But we know that education is a factor, right? Youth who are homeless, the dropout rate in Canada amongst housed youth is less than 9%. Amongst homeless youth, it's around, it's over 50%. So it involves housing, involves child protection, training, justice, corrections, income support, mental health. There's lots of parts of our state apparatus and our institutions and our nonprofit sector that have a role to play in preventing homelessness. It can never be solved by the sector alone. That requires a very different way of thinking, and it means that people have to be called into account in terms of their responsibility. So I'm going to go through this quickly so that I meet that mark of finishing exactly on time, kind of, but not really. And so think again about that public health model of homelessness. What does that actually look like in terms of addressing homelessness? Right? So we overlay on top of the primary, secondary, tertiary, this typology that identifies 5 areas of action. The first one is about structural prevention. So legislation, policy, and investment that builds assets and increases social inclusion and equity. So it can mean a lot of things, from poverty reduction to income supports. All of these things tend to be more population-based, but if we did these well, we would reduce the incidence of homelessness. Now, the reality is that's a lot of work, that's going to take a lot of time. I don't think we can wait for that to happen. So we have to think about other approaches here. The second thing is think about what is the role of specific legislation that addresses homelessness prevention. And here, Wales is a really interesting example. They put in place the Prevention of Homelessness Legislation Act, and that has now been, a similar legislation has been put in place by the British government, which is interesting because they're a conservative government and they went down that road. And what's unique about this act is it says if public authorities become aware that someone is at risk of homelessness or that they're newly homeless, there's a duty to assist. So if you know someone's about to be evicted or they've been evicted, there's a statutory requirement that we do something to help them not be homeless. And it doesn't mean an emergency shelter. It means working to help them get housed or not lose their housing. And they've actually seen their homeless numbers drop since that legislation. So there's things we could learn about that in Canada. What if we had a duty to assist? What if we made it so that if a teacher knows that Johnny is couch surfing, that someone has to do something about it? So let's think about that. Systems prevention. So, addressing the systems that drive homelessness. So we need to fix policy and procedural barriers to facilitate program access and support. So we all know people have trouble accessing things and there are boundaries between services and systems. People who are vulnerable often have real difficulty navigating those very systems. So we have to make them work more effectively to help people who are in trouble. We have to enhance access to systems and services. Here's the thing, like most people, if you become homeless, it's not necessarily clear that you would have any idea what's out there to support you. Like a young person who's left home and got kicked out of home isn't going to go, I'm going to go on the internet and see where I can find some family mediation support. Because you don't know what you don't know. So we have to make better access. And the third thing is we need to do a better job on reintegration and transitions. Right? These big institutions that are dumping people into homelessness, we have to stop it. Right? We know it's happening, we have to stop it. So early intervention. So policies and practices support individuals and families at imminent risk of homelessness who have recently become homeless. We can build our systems and institutions around this. Other countries work on this principle, right? So how do we create a system where there's early warning and early detection so that when someone is at risk of homelessness, we can provide them with the kind of supports they need, right? So this is a diagram done by Dennis Culhane, Brackerts and Winter, that shows, where is the responsibility and who's responsible. So the early intervention piece, that's not the homelessness sector's responsibility. The structural prevention pieces, not the homelessness sector's responsibility. But it can play a role when there are trigger events and we know that things go wrong, right? So it involves outreach, identification, and engagement. So people need to know, we need to get out there and help people and help people understand that there is things that will be supportive. We need some kind of coordinated access so that wherever you are, say in a city like Edmonton, you can get access to the help, either through self-referral or somebody helping you. We need case management and systems navigation. The bootstrap method is not good enough. We're talking about people who are in crisis, people who maybe experienced trauma. To expect them to figure out how to get out, some people can do it, but a lot can't. And that's how we wind up with a long-term homeless problem. And we need place-based supports. We have to help keep people in place, not expect everyone, once you're homeless, to leave your community, whether it's a small town, you're in Wabamun and you have to come to Edmonton, or you're in a suburb of Edmonton, you have to come downtown. Help people stay connected, because what keeps people going are the natural supports in their lives, whether it's family, neighbors, for young people, teachers, coaches, this kind of thing. Keep people in place so that if they move, it's in a safe and planned way, not because they're running away from something. Evictions prevention. Programs and strategies designed to keep people at risk of eviction in their home and avoid homelessness. Here's something that seems to be fixable. This is a map or a diagram explaining how the eviction process works in Ontario. And I suspect it may be similar here, right? So if a landlord is going to evict someone, they have to issue a notice of eviction. There's a public record of who has been issued these orders. We have real-time database on who's facing eviction. So we know where they are. What if we went to them, the people and the landlords, and found out what's going on and helped people retain their housing? Or if they can't stay there, swooped in right away and helped them get new housing. Right? These are things that are doable. And then finally, housing stability. How do we help people both before being homeless, but certainly after we've rehoused them? How do we ensure that they stay housed? And this requires doing housing first, but doing it well. A challenge is that sometimes housing first, we do housing first light, which is get people housed and then throw the keys through the mailbox and run away. Housing first done well means we find the supports and offer the supports and stick with the person, give them the supports they need. And it will differ person by person. It differs by subpopulation. And we know when we do it well that we have positive outcomes. But when we try to do it on the cheap, it's not going to work so well. There's good evidence there. The future of housing first is to figure out how to make it work for those subpopulations. So as I mentioned before, right? How does it work for youth, right? Because the adult model does not meet the needs of developing adolescents and young adults. It doesn't work. The research evidence shows that. We were talking about this before. We've developed a framework for Housing First for Youth. I'm going to talk about it later. How do we do an Indigenous-led Housing First program that's based on cultural reconnection and support? How do we design Housing First to meet the needs of women who are in unsafe situations, right? That's where we need to go with Housing First. So there are ways of thinking about prevention that can be applied in communities. And so where does this leave us now? Where do we go from here? All levels of government, all orders of government have to be involved in thinking about homelessness work. And what we need to do is make sure that homelessness becomes a priority. So let's talk about what's going on. The government of Canada is right now in the process of putting in place a national housing strategy with a new investment. As part of that, they're renewing their homelessness strategy for a 10-year period. They're looking at an investment. The Government of Canada played a strong leadership role in helping bring housing first across Canada. This is an opportunity where they could again show leadership and saying, yes, we want you to do housing first, but we also want you to focus on prevention. And I have a strong feeling that they're actually going to go in that direction, which would be amazing because, again, homelessness prevention in North America has been a dirty word until recently. Provinces and territories. Where's the action there? Alberta is the very first province to have a homelessness strategy. Very first province in Canada. Woohoo! Wow, I'm more excited about it than you probably. But they also have the first province to have a youth homelessness strategy. And embedded in that, not implicitly, but explicitly, is the role of homelessness prevention. Ontario now has a strategy. We're the second. And Quebec has one. Quebec is interested in focusing on prevention too. So is Ontario. Ontario hasn't articulated the plan as clearly as elsewhere, but we'll get there. So there's hope. And then what about at the community level? So here we are in Edmonton. So Homeward Trust just had the update of its homelessness strategy approved. And within that, there is a focus on prevention. So Homeward Trust, as an institution that supports communities to address homelessness, has been a leader in innovation in many areas. I think around addressing Indigenous homelessness, what I find amazing with Homeward Trust is at the board level, staff level, and at the supporting communities level, they focused on bringing Indigenous people and communities into the picture as part of the solution. Homeward Trust in Edmonton has had more success through its Housing First than most communities in Canada. So this is a chance for Edmonton to really leap into the fore. So already I know that there's interest in dealing with people leaving institutional contexts, whether it's prison or child protection, that kind of thing. We're going to see how it rolls out over time, but it's a chance for Edmonton to be a leader. And no, there's not a slide about Calgary, so don't worry. Okay, so in thinking about it, right, so that's all theory and the concept, like where would a good place to start be on homelessness prevention? I would argue addressing youth homelessness is a really good place. And I'll give you two areas to think about. One is that there's an urgency to address youth homelessness early on. We did a national survey last year of young people who are homeless, over 1,100 respondents, and we found out some interesting things. We found that 40% of all currently homeless youth had their first episode of homelessness before they were 16 years old, and about 15% before they were 13. That group of young people is more likely to be characterized by adverse childhood experiences like physical, sexual, emotional abuse, more likely to have been involved in child protection services, more likely to have had a long history of housing instability, right? More likely to have been diagnosed with a learning disability, more likely to have been bullied in school. And so a key point there is that most communities, their response to youth homelessness doesn't begin until 16 or 18 years old. So we're waiting way too long. We're waiting till the damage really sets in. That's bad policy. Another thing that happens with young people who are homeless is when they become homeless, they're very vulnerable to exploitation. There's a study done by Covenant House International that looked at 10 cities in North America, 2 in Canada, Vancouver and Toronto, and found that 20% of currently homeless youth have been trafficked, mostly for sex trafficking. As part of that study, they found, in Toronto, they talked to Covenant House and the young people in Covenant's house and said, have you been approached to work in the sex trade since you've been in the shelter? And almost every young woman said yes. Right? Because what happens is that pimps and their proxies, the young women who work for them, often go into the shelters posing as homeless youth, and they're recruiting. And why does that happen? Because our emergency response warehouses young people, and essentially we have a big neon arrow on top that says, here they are, vulnerable youth, come and get them, right? We know from our research that the mental health problems of young people are quite profound. In this study, we found that 85% their mental health problems were at such a high level that if they were housed, they would be between inpatient and outpatient mental health care. And a lot of the problems happen before homeless for some young people, but it's being on the streets, being victims of crime, victims of exploitation. So to build a system around just the emergency services and supports, and to expect young people to bootstrap themselves out of homelessness is a flawed approach, but I also think it's an immoral approach. So that's the first reason why we need to address youth homelessness prevention. The second piece is that we know a lot about what to do. That's good news. There's a lot of innovation, most of it from outside of Canada, but some from in Canada, about how to intervene on youth homelessness, right? And this is a kind of a model of how it should work, right? If we know that young people are at imminent risk of homelessness, we need to get them into the system, case manage them, and have program models that will either allow them to return home in a safe and planned way or to move into housing in a safe and planned way. And so we know there are program models that work, that are evidence-based. School-based programs. This is where Australia is leading. In the 1990s, when their youth homelessness population exploded, they said, I don't think building homeless shelters for youth is a good idea. What if we prevented it? Let's get into the schools. And why schools? Because every young person who's homeless was in school once, and very likely there was an adult in their life who knew something was wrong, a teacher or a coach. So what they do is they do a community school partnership and work to the youth agencies come into the schools, talk with young people, talk with teachers, talk with families, and when young people are identified, then an intervention can happen, right? And the latest version of this is the Geelong project, which we're bringing to Canada as the Upstream project, where they do a screener for every student starting at the age of 12. Everyone in the school gets this assessment that looks at risks and assets. Risk of becoming homeless, risk of criminal involvement, risk of dropping out. You have that last one to get the schools invested in it. From that, they identify who's at risk, and they do a second assessment through an interview. And then they do an intervention to support the young person and their family. And they've had tremendous success with that. We need to bring that to Canada, and we're doing that now. The second thing is build family and natural supports. This is the key to anybody. succeeding, right? And one of the challenges with youth homelessness is that because many young people have those adverse childhood experiences, when they become homeless, we want family to be part of their past, right? But young people who experience abuse in the home, it doesn't mean every family member was abusing them or all relationships are irredeemable. We need to do that, and we need to build natural supports outside of the family, because we built a system where young people wind up leaving home, and then they're reliant on other homeless youth who have weak social capital and professional support. If we want a long-term solution, let's work with families and young people and build those supports. It's good examples of that, and in Alberta, including Edmonton, we're doing a province-wide demonstration projects on how to do that work. Right? And so that's very exciting. The third is Youth Reconnect. This is keeping young people in place. We're going to have time to tell a quick story. All right. So in St. Catharines, Ontario, there's a guy, an organization called RAFT, and they had an emergency shelter for youth. And so they started with 8 beds, and then they had to, turn people away, so they added 8 more, and then they eventually got to 24 beds. And they couldn't add any more because the building wouldn't allow for it. So Mike Lefty, who ran it, had been making these observations that many of the young people who were coming to stay at the shelter actually came from small towns, Fort Erie, Welland, this kind of thing. And they would couch surf in the community until there was nowhere else to go, and then they'd have to leave town because there's nothing for them. So they wind up going to Niagara Falls. There's predators and bad things happen. By the time they get to St. Catharines, they're met at the, by drug dealers and pimps who Mike jokes, but it's true, who have better outreach than he does, right? And they come to the shelter already ill and damaged in many ways. And so we thought, what if we use some of our funding to hire youth workers to go back to Fort Erie, go back to Welland and work with the community, work with young people, advertise it as a support so people could, self-refer, but also work with the schools, and then do the work with young people and the family. And I keep saying that, and the family, because the client in those cases isn't just the young person, it's the family that may need supports too. And that program's worked with great success. Now they're down to about 8 people a night at the shelter. It's success in one way, except for one thing. The viability of the shelter is now in doubt. Did so well, he's doing himself out of a job. They're paid on a per diem basis. We incentivize shelters to fill beds. I don't know what it's like in Alberta. They may have a different funding model. But anyway, he managed to convince the board that this was actually better than having a full shelter. So these are good examples of interventions that can work. Okay, I'm going to now go to one other thing. Exiting systems. In Canada, less than 0.5% of all young people have had involvement with child protection. In our survey, over 57% reported involvement in child protection. I think 47% were either in foster care or group homes. You talk about a canary in the mine shaft. There's a problem there, but that's one we can fix. And it's one we must fix because that current system of dumping is not good enough, right? And there's lots of good ideas, and I know there's reforms in Alberta that are taking place. There are in Ontario too, but we should really look at how, as I said earlier, if we take someone into care as a society, we're obligated to see them through until they can transition to adulthood and well-being, not cut them loose too early. There's good examples in Europe where they have what's called the aftercare guarantee, where young people are provided the option of support. They can opt in and out. That support may mean staying with their foster family, if that's a good thing, because that might be what they want and the family wants. It may mean going to school or university. It pays for housing. It treats young people basically the way I would treat my own. And this is the thing about prevention, right? And we could talk about similar approaches for youth leaving corrections. If we want to serve youth well and focus on prevention, what we should put at the middle of our thinking is what would be okay for you and your children, right? What do my kids need? I always joke my kids lived in transitional housing for years, and it was called My House, right? They had housing, they had adults there to support them, they had food, we tried to encourage them to stay in school, They were allowed to make mistakes and experiment. They weren't at risk of being kicked out for breaking rules, but someday they had to leave, right? What if we built that system for any young person who's at risk of homelessness and said, we're going to stick with you until you're 24, until you're on your feet. We're going to do what we need to. And for those who think, wow, that's really expensive, I'm going to close with one figure that's really important. A recent study was released by Eric Latimer, an economist from McGill University, where he calculated that the cost of keeping someone in a state of homelessness for 12 months is between, depending on the city involved, between $52,000 and $58,000 a year. Think of that. You talk about an expensive approach. That's expensive. You could take that $56,000, pay for somebody's rent, give them food, and slap 2 social workers on their back, and it would probably cost less than that, right? So we can do this differently, and we must do it differently. And we can change the focus to prevention. It's going to take political will in the community level and at all levels of government. And then the final thing here is Housing First for Youth. So this is a program model that we've developed in response to communities' claims that Housing First doesn't work for youth, right? And this is a model of stability for young people. Again, building it around what does any young person need. So we give people options in housing. We don't force them into one thing. We let them make decisions based on options. And we build our model of support around what any young person needs, right? So it isn't just that we're going to give you housing, right, and that you get it for 6 months or a year. We're going to stick with you. We're going to help you deal with your health and well-being. We're going to make sure you're safe. We're going to encourage you to go back to school if that's what you want. We're going to work with you on setting goals. We're going to work on social inclusion, getting you included in the communities that you want to be part of. We're going to help you transition to adulthood. And so we're doing demonstration projects on this. There's a really good version of this that's being delivered by Boys and Girls Clubs of Calgary right now called Infinity, and they've adapted it for our Indigenous youth in a program model called Home Fire. So our youth homelessness prevention framework we're going to release early next year, and it's going to give those details for communities on what to do. And so the point is, we can end homelessness. We can end homelessness, but we have to add prevention to the mix that includes housing first. So thank you. How about that?
Thank you, that was awesome. Can I just turn on this? I'm sure you'll all agree that was an incredible presentation, extremely thought-provoking. I love your ideas of transitional housing.
Yeah.
I'm just curious, one quick question. Where is the Geelong upstream project coming to?
Right now it's in Niagara region and York region, and it's coming soon to Ottawa. There's talk about it coming to Calgary.
Okay.
And I mean, it's something that can work in every community. Every community has schools, and every community has young people who are struggling and their families. So we need to, so we're doing research on it because we need the evidence base to convince people that this is the way to go.
And we definitely have to find a way to get outreach better than the drug dealers and pimps.
That's right.
Yeah. Now, I actually know that there are people in this room that have contributed to the Housing First and the Alberta Housing Strategy, and so I'm hoping that we'll have a really engaged and vigorous conversation this afternoon. So we're opening it up to questions. There's also questions online, I believe, and someone will be moderating that. So if you're online, you can just type your questions into the box. And, but we already have questions in the room, so I'm going to open it up to our first person. Is that,
There we go. There we go. That's working.
Okay. Hi, thanks for your talk.
Hi.
So I work for an organization called the Alberta Rural Development Network.
Right.
So I manage I manage homelessness programs for the rural and remote stream for HPS. So I just wanted to ask you about rural and remote homelessness because this is often a forgotten type of homelessness. I didn't even really think about this type of homelessness, and I grew up in a town in Alberta. And one of their questions mainly was on housing first, because if you work in this area, you find like it's like housing first all day, every day right now, which is because it's such a great, and now evidence-based approach. But one of the things we find in rural is that it often doesn't work because there's no affordable housing in a lot of these towns, but yet so much of the funding is going towards people trying to do housing first programs, yet forgetting that there's no housing. And this matters to cities because if people can't get services in rural communities for homelessness, that they migrate into the cities and become chronically homeless here. So I just wanted to ask your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's a problem that you hear elsewhere in Canada. The conditions of, the context is different in rural and small town areas. There may not be affordable housing. And so that model of, just like finding the rental properties where there aren't any means that maybe you have to think about models of accommodation differently. One of the approaches I didn't talk about there around prevention is what they call host homes, right? Which is a community-based approach where people might have an extra room in their house or something like that. And they've shown great success with that with youth in the UK, and now they're doing it with adults. And so you get the community involved because people might have an extra room, and it's important. I think in rural and remote areas too, they have to consider homelessness in a broader spatial sense as well, right? What is the connection to that next community? Because often people move to the city and things don't turn out well. So how do you support people to come back? There's a place in Perth, Ontario where they're doing a lot of interesting work around youth, right? And that connection to the city is important, right? So the work you're doing, you have to consider, is it possible to stay connected to people when they leave town in some way? Because they may need help in coming back, rather than they just disappear into the abyss of Edmonton or Red Deer or something. So
Actually, one of our projects is a host project in Cochrane.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. That's cool. Okay. See that? And how's that going?
Great. Really good.
Yeah. Because it keeps them in place, right? Then they can still go to school, their same
Usually,
school.
Yeah.
And so like these are good approaches. The place-based approaches are where it's at. I mean, people will move to cities, right? Like for good reasons, but you want people to move in a safe and a planned way, not because they have no options, So yeah, that's good. So it sounds like you're doing some interesting work in that area. Thanks.
Good to be here. Thank you so much. I really appreciate the homelessness prevention framework. It's some of the best language that you put together on that. Really appreciate it. Just a couple things questions I have for you. Is you brought up the service use, like cost prevention piece of it, is that we can probably give people a whole rent and social workers and everything else, and they'll probably save money. For me, a close reading of the at-home trace law randomized control trial really tells me that it's only cost effective for those who are really the very high end of the service use stream, and it's probably unlikely to be cost effective for youth. So how would you sell a youth housing first program in that light? And then the other piece is with your youth framework, you tend to lump in youth between the age of 13 and 24, which I can see some of the benefit from that. As a psychologist who's done some work in the developmental stream, that seems a little bit odd to me to lump in that wide development range. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on those.
Okay, so one of the things we need to do is some cost modeling, projecting forward, not just like on an annual basis, comparing housed versus homeless. But look over the long run, what are the consequences? The reason I'm thinking that is that there have been studies that look at comparing high school dropouts to those who complete high school and projecting forward the differences in terms of healthcare utilization, involvement in the criminal justice system, labor force participation, use of being on benefits and that kind of thing. And they project that there's quite a difference there. And so I'm suggesting that we need to think about that with youth homelessness, where if we give young people, either expect them to bootstrap or minimum supports, and we haven't dealt with their trauma, and they're still, they dropped out of school, so they have poor education, compare that to an approach that's going to put them on more solid ground, I think we could make a better justification for the investment. And the second question, remind me again, because
You lump it together 13.
Oh, no, I completely agree with you on that. It's for space here, you know, we can't talk about that, but you need a very different approach for young people under 16, right? And you need a different approach for 16 to 18 and 18 and above. And having said that, you also have to take into account the differences in development, right? That some people are developmentally delayed, and the effect of trauma on all young people. But I think, you know, just as it's unhealthy to put an 18-year-old into a shelter with 30 to 50-year-olds, it's unhealthy to put a young person in with people in their early 20s, right? So we need to really target and build it around what are the needs of young people at that point in their life, right? And for those under 16, the reason we don't do a good job in most places is because we think the only approach, or what we mostly have to offer is child protection intervention, which may or may not be what's needed, right? But we need to like provide young people and their families with that kind of support. The Housing First for Youth model, if you can see, well, you can't see now, but if you looked at it, the models of accommodation include helping young people stay at home in transitional housing, right? Like you're not going to put a 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old in scattered site housing, right? It has to be.
They haven't tried.
Well, maybe, but you also have to let young people change their mind too, right? Like they may try that and find out it doesn't work. So we have to really build it, you know, start with that. What does an adolescent and developing adolescent and young adult need, and what are the differences based on their own personal development, but what's age appropriate and what's possible, and come up with really good solutions, right? And so some of those, you know, school-based interventions or the Youth Reconnect, those are really work well with young people who are still in school, right? So we need to do more of that kind of work and not make the homelessness system the outcome for those young people, right? And in fact, that may not even be who should be doing the work, although there's really good youth workers. We need youth programs and people with expertise. We need access to mental health supports for young people. I don't know what it's like in Alberta, but in Ontario, that's a real problem, right? There's not enough supports available for young people and their families, right? So definitely we need to think about the differences in age, like the differences between 13 all the way up to 24 is like massive, right? And so we have to consider that. There's not a one size fits all.
It's good to hear that.
Good, okay, thanks. Really tricky questions so far, so I need a few lobs, like just I need, like, so I can just.
I don't think you're going to get a lot.
So thank you again. This is the clearest, most sophisticated presentation I've ever heard of definitions, causes, solutions. Your typology is wonderful.
Thank you.
Having said that,
I knew another shoe was going to drop.
I know at least 90% of everything you said, and I am not the smartest person in this room. Many other people know it too. I know low-level provincial bureaucrats who know it.
Yep.
And there are even federal civil servants who know it.
That's right.
We do not do it.
Yeah,
We have not restarted in a serious way building affordable housing since 1990.
Yep.
The one good thing we did was Housing First, but that doesn't fix everything. How do we go from what we know to actually doing it? Like, what's going to be the difference? Because almost none of this is new. And
Nor is it shocking.
How can we do it?
Yeah, well, it's a change management question. And you're right, like it's hard, even if we know what to do, right? Because in my view, this is just an opinion, but as much as people hate the present, they hate change more, right? And that's true in government, it's true interpersonally, right? That kind of thing. So we have to work hard at it. It involves working in different places and spaces. We have to nurture leadership where people are going to want to like take a chance on doing things differently. And that's at the community level. It's also within government. You're absolutely right about within government, right? And we have to learn how to engage government differently than sometimes we naturally want to do, right? I've talked with some people today, but you know, like homelessness advocacy in Ontario has historically been, I better watch in case this is going to be broadcast, but it hasn't always worked, right? Because the response is typically to point out what's horribly wrong without offering any way out. Or to imagine that if you just embarrass government, that they'll, you know, or if you chant, what do we want? Housing, what do we need now? If that's chanted 5 million times, it won't add 1 unit of housing. So we have to get better at that kind of work. We have to seize opportunities. I mean, in Alberta, you had a provincial government do the first homelessness strategy. Your premier is Ed Stelmach. Would you have thought that would have, you know, good for him that he did that, right? That's a start. Like, that was a big deal in Canada. You know who was the president? We were talking about this before, this is studying, but the president in the US who created the biggest shift in investment on homelessness? It's George W. Bush, who at that time we thought, you couldn't possibly have a more idiotic president. You know? So it's like leadership, right? And so like when I mentioned the government of Canada now, right? Like maybe there's chance, like we have to like find out where the spots are and get there. What we need in Canada to move this direction though, is we need more facts on the ground around prevention. We need more examples that we can point to because communities will say, and I've heard this, it's like, well, we would do prevention, but we don't know what to do. And it's like, you know, well, figure it out. It's like, right? And so that's part of the work is to really be able to demonstrate that things work. And, you know, taking things to scale is challenging. It involves scaling out to, you know, communicate that we can do things differently. It involves scaling up to align government policy and funding, right? Like if government policy and funding continues to prioritize the same old thing, it doesn't matter what happens at the community level. And then we need to scale down to ensure that there's capacity, readiness, leadership, the systems integration necessary to do it. And it's going to be, so you got to work on all those levels at once and hope that there will be change. You know, and so while we're not there, I think the evidence in Alberta, while it hasn't like solved homelessness, it's miles ahead of what's been happening in other communities, right? And so, you know, I have to remain hopeful, otherwise I will go over there and start crying, and no one wants to see that.
Are you okay to go for another 5 minutes?
That is because I talk too long, and so that's the bargain.
But if we can say go for another 5 minutes so we can get the people who are in line.
Sure, that's fine.
And then there will be time in the reception.
That's true. For more tricky questions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hi.
Hi.
So just this afternoon, we were having coffee with community members with Edmonton who has lived experience in homelessness.
Yep.
And he had some really good insights. So he was saying that from a young age, we're very conditioned to looking at the contributions of people in society as economic. And if it's not economic, it is not people. And he pointed out that he would rather, and has in the past, chosen to be homeless rather than contributing to the systems of oppression that stem from colonialism and capitalism, you know, rather than getting like a 9-to-5 job, which he sort of implied was like akin to slavery to the system. So in that light, what do you think the role is for policy and decolonialization in productive policing?
Well, I think there is a role, and we have to address that. Absolutely, we have to face that, and so that's long-term work. You talk about a change, like addressing the outcomes of, you know, our history of colonialism. It's going to be a lot of work. We have to acknowledge it and do something about it instead of just like paying lip service to it. And you know, we're in for the long haul on that one. In terms of that person's comments, that's interesting. I would say just be wary of ever taking an individual just because they have an experience of something, their perspective and generalizing it, right? Because we all have our own experience that may or may not be generalizable to anyone else. But most certainly we have to deal with that. That's part of the, you know, primary prevention work we have to do, right? And so there, you know, we haven't had a good history of addressing that. But there are some promising signs at a more smaller scale level of how we can do that in more interesting ways. You know, I was talking about Housing First for Youth in Calgary with the Infinity Project. They, and this is like at the program level, so it's not a systems level change, but they found with their very good Housing First for Youth program that the outcomes for Indigenous youth were very poor. So they decided to develop a model. They called it Home Fire, the idea being that for Indigenous people, home is not considered in terms of like a structure, a house. It's where your family is, and that's around the fire. They had Indigenous elders and youth work in developing the project, and it's all about cultural connection and support and engagement. And the program is an absolutely interesting model of how an Indigenous-led Housing First for Youth program can work. And now the outcomes for those young people are better than for Infinity, right? So you know, there is that level. That certainly doesn't address the big structural and historical piece, but it's a way that, you know, like it's part of the solution. There's no like silver bullet on that.
Yeah, I guess just considering especially that 50% of our homeless population is Indigenous people. So I guess just something to consider is how we can integrate that into all the policies we face around homelessness. Because if we're not addressing it specifically, then perhaps we're only addressing homelessness issues for half the population.
Yeah, and I would go further than that. I agree with you. But, you know, and that's been my position. But I'm going to go one step further. And that is, rather than, you know, just think about, like, how do we integrate Indigenous ways of knowing and practices into supporting Indigenous people, the more that I've delved into that, I think we need to integrate Indigenous ways of knowing into how we deal with all homelessness, right? Like, there's a lot of practices and approaches and philosophy there, you know, that we need to learn from. And that's part of the decolonization process, is to learn that the relationship should be two-way, that we can benefit massively by incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into the way we think about the problem and the solution. So that's kind of an exciting direction, which was a piece of learning and unlearning for me personally. But, you know, I'm hoping that to learn more about how to do that or think about that as we go forward. Thanks.
Last question.
To what extent do you think a universal basic income would prevent homelessness?
It would be a big deal. And it wouldn't prevent all homelessness, but it would be important along the way, right? Because a lot of the problems we're trying to solve can be addressed by having an adequate income. You know, I was talking with, like, Val Tarasic is a nutritionist who I've done work with, that we've done work with, right? And she always makes this point that, you know, people think, well, low-income people, they need cooking courses and they need to be taken to the store and taught how to shop. And she's like, you know what they need is money. And I'm going to close with one story, okay, that's related to this, right? I was in Boston once where these young people at Harvard University decided to open a homelessness shelter in Harvard, just off Harvard Square, if you're familiar with it there. So, you know, they got together and did all this. And so when they were opening it, they had this big ceremony at this old wooden church in Boston, beautiful church on Harvard campus. And the place was packed, right? And beautiful old church. And they had, like, presentations by everyone, standing ovations, you know, the young people who put it together, standing ovations, woo-hoo, the developer who built the thing, standing ovations, woo-hoo, you know, everybody who was involved, you know, some young person does a botched version of a Beyonce song, woo-hoo, everyone's on their feet, right? And so at the end, there was a state senator from Massachusetts who came up to speak. He was the last speaker. So we're sitting in the front row there, right? My partner and me. And so he comes up and he talks and he says, you know, congratulations on doing this. This is really great, you know, but I just want to say that this is not the end game. We can't be satisfied that this is the solution. He says, you know, people always ask me about poverty. Why are people, what drives poverty? Is it about mental health problems? Is it about people being alcoholics? what is it that makes poverty? And he said, the problem with poverty isn't that, it's that people don't have enough money. And then he says, homelessness, what's that? Is it about, the causes and, like some of the stuff I was putting on, about family breakdown? He says, the problem is people don't have homes. And so he concluded by saying, we need to at some point have that adult conversation about these issues, right? And figure out how we can assure, right, and this is a structural response, that people have adequate income and have housing as a right, and that as a society we make sure that people don't fall into homelessness. And so my partner and I stand up, whooping it up, woo, this is amazing, this guy's like speaking truth to power, and we're like, and we turn around, and we're the only people standing up. So, to get to your question, it's going to take a while, but like sometimes the solutions are there. Like Minister Duclos, who's responsible for the National Housing Strategy and the Homelessness Strategy. He's a researcher, so how about that? A university professor as a cabinet minister. And his research has been on guaranteed basic income. And, and so there's experiments happening in Ontario, there's the historical work done in Manitoba. So I'm a believer in that, especially when we look at the way the economy is being restructured today, where we may never get back to a time where there are good, well-paying jobs with pensions in this country, right? And so what are we going to do about that, right? We've got to do something about that. So I don't think that will necessarily end homelessness, but it's a key structural factor that will help us. And if we know people have housing and have income, that's half the problem. Then we give people the supports to deal with the other issues that are important. Thank you.
We could tell from the in-depth questions, you didn't get a single lob.
Oh, there was no lob there.
That people are really engaged.